Good evening. Really? Okay. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. I'm Jelani Cobb. I'm the Dean of the Journalism School, and I'm really excited to welcome you all here for this event. I will say preciously little and get out of the way and let this event take place, but as part of my official welcome, I would like to point out that this program is a collaboration between the Center for the Study of Social Difference, Columbia University Department of Anthropology, the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender, the Middle East Institute, and the South Asia Institute. I was in a meeting with President Shafiq just a few days ago, and she said, Columbia has a reputation for being really siloed, but in fact, there's a good deal of collaboration that happens here. And her theory is that it's because everyone is in Columbia housing and we run into each other in the elevator. And I thought about that because I actually collaborated with a journalism project with an economist at Columbia because our daughters play together. And that's how we connected. And then the day that she said that, I ran into a computer scientist in the elevator, literally in the elevator, and we started talking about our joint undertakings. So I say all that to say that it's really great to see all of these institutions at Columbia participating in this event, for this very important book, part of a crucial and evolving body of literature. We are excited about this conversation, particularly excited because our own faculty member in the School of Journalism, Professor Nina Berman, is one of the contributors to this volume as well. Professor Abu-Lughod will come up and introduce the panel momentarily, and we are happy to have you all out this evening and looking forward to the discussion. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for honoring us with this welcome and actually explaining what we're about. Many of you know I'm Lila Abu-Lughod, and I'm a professor of anthropology and gender studies here at Columbia, and one of the conveners of this project out of which the book grew. And it's really just such a fantastic day for us. I'm thrilled to see you all here, especially so many friends. And I'm especially happy to have this really brilliant group of feminist scholars here to talk about their contributions to this book and to celebrate its publication by Duke University Press, whose executive editor is here. We're very happy to see him. And afterwards, there will be some copies of the book for sale. I shouldn't tell you, Ken, but with a discount. But we wanted to make it easy for you. So this book was more than 5 years in the making, the outcome of this very intensely collaborative work that I think is really the ideal of what we can do through the support that the Academy at its very best offers us, time and space for rigorous and honest research and critical reflection. And we're grateful to all those who made that possible for us, especially to the Center for the Study of Social Difference that Jelani mentioned, whose mission is to facilitate exactly this kind of global collaborative exchange, and very importantly, the Henry Luce Foundation, whose initiative on religion and international affairs made it possible for so many of us, both scholars and journalists, and that I think was one of the the missions of that initiative, whose program officer is here too, Toby Volkman. Made it possible for us to pursue the hard questions that we pursued and to push against the common sense. And today, I also wanted to thank all the volunteers that are probably scattered around who helped make this possible. It's never easy to pull off an event and make sure everybody has seats and everybody's here and has water. So our project began its life as something called Religion and the Global Framing of Gender Violence. But because of the intimate knowledge that each of the contributors and many participants who aren't even in the book had of the regions in which they worked, and as you'll hear, the kind of troubling issues of violence and gender that they saw, we just couldn't be confined to that rubric. And many of you here shared the journey with us. And now that the Cunning of Gender Violence, Geopolitics and Feminism is out, we're really excited that other people can think with us because it was so important to us.
Swipe up from the bottom to the middle of the screen.
There we go. Some visitors, uninvited guests. But we were pushed to this project by our observation that feminism had seemed to gain success over the past few decades in global institutions working against violence against women or gender-based violence. And as scholars, as ethnographers, as practitioners, as activists who focused on the everyday lives of people and politics of gender and religion and colonial and imperial violence, especially in the Middle East and South Asia, where Muslim immigrants from these regions now live in the West, each of us was troubled in a different way by the particular ways some feminist visions and some ways of addressing gendered violence, but not others, were being codified in international organizations. They were deployed in human rights, by human rights groups. They were incorporated into state and foreign policy, and they were active in both military and humanitarian interventions. So I don't have to tell you, although I was thinking about the generations, but I don't have to tell you that at the turn of the 21st century, international support for women's rights coalesced around the figure of the oppressed Muslim woman, particularly in Afghanistan, and the fallout is still with us. But the harnessing of a feminist agenda to legitimize violent military intervention in the name of protecting women against violence alerted us, I think our generation maybe more than others, to the problems with this. And so what are the implications of the success of some feminists who began to walk the halls of power, the success they had in mainstreaming an agenda about violence against women? How does the agenda play itself out in different places and different projects? And over time, we gave the name, probably it was you, Rema, but over time we gave the name to the institutionalized apparatus and agendas of what Janet Halley and her colleagues have called governance feminism. And we called it GBVOW. Capital G-B-V-A-W, gender-based violence against women, an acronym, right, that we just capitalized. And because our first concerns were with actual forms of gender violence and gendered violence on the ground, what we now call small g, gender violence, and we think everybody should care about that, we began to worry. We began to worry about the ways the prevailing assumptions and technologies for treating gendered violence might be affirming or sustaining dominant rationales of power. So with Middle East and South Asia as our analytical sites, we had to come to terms with the ways that religion and racialized ethnicity, particularly what we call the Muslim question, ran so deeply through the international governance structures dedicated to combating violence against women and gender-based violence, and that's what we call GBVOW. Now, what strategies? We had to come up with strategies to help us think or rethink the relationship between the myriad forms of and experiences of gender violence, small g, and the problematic racialized codification of this feminist agenda to combat. What strategies could we use? And we ended up with this Hegelian concept of the cunning. We found it productive in thinking about or capturing the ways that a well-meaning and even visionary feminist commitment to end or address all forms of gendered violence gets folded into contemporary world affairs. And we organized the book in terms of what we sort of came to think of as the major circuits of power along which efforts to treat violence seem to be traveling. And we asked, what's dangerous about these circuits and allying with them? And so we identified 4 key circuits of power, as we called them. First, the global security world order. Second, states and state institutions that themselves perpetrate violence, but are rarely or only selectively punished for that. Third, what we call the civilizational industries, which is what we're talking about today, that intervene in other parts of the world in the name of humanitarianism or development. And that's our focus. And then the 4th circuit of power we identified was mass media, whose gatekeeping and representation support these interventions in ways that Nina will talk about, and and this is the right place to be talking about those. So, we asked ourselves, what's the price of inclusion for feminists? If we recognize securitization, militarization, state violence, corporate developmentalism, humanitarianism as in themselves violent and racializing, then we need to look at what GB Vow does and doesn't do when it attaches itself to these forms. And again, we go back to Janet Halley and her colleagues, but as she put it so succinctly, we need to think about the 5 C's of that alignment with power risk: collaboration, compromise, collusion, complicity, and co-optation. And this is really tricky territory. And each of the contributors to this book has mapped the dynamics in a different way, which brings me to today. So I'm sure you want to hear them, and I'm looking forward to it too. So I'm just going to introduce very, very briefly these amazing colleagues in the order in which they're going to talk, which is not the order of the poster. And they're going to talk about how they came to this subject that they wrote about, and what they found. And you can check their bios. They're known to many of us, but you can check their bios in the book, the fuller bios, and hopefully you'll read their chapters as well. And then you'll know how lucky we are to be here. So I've learned from each of them so much. I know I'm not supposed to go on about this kind of thing, but I just can't help it. I've learned so much from each of them, and we worked really hard together. And they helped me see the world in a new way, and maybe we all did that for each other. And we also thought hard about how we might use what we know, our knowledge and our analyses, to intervene in matters that are really of deep concern to all of us and should be to everyone. So Dina Siddiqi, I think, is going first. She's familiar to many of us here at Columbia, has taught here with me, including and many other places. She's currently clinical professor, associate professor of global liberal studies at NYU downtown. But she also taught for many years at Brak University in Bangladesh. And she's a scholar who's also a feminist activist, putting her in a very tricky position sometimes, working on development, on labor, and feminist politics in Bangladesh. And her chapter, I realized, you wouldn't know what their themes were. Her chapter in our book is called Child Marriage in the Feminist Imagination. Then we have Sima Shakhsari, Associate Professor of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota, who just flew in this morning, and author of the book Politics of Rightful Killing, Civil Society, Gender, and Sexuality in Weblogistan. And their current research is on Iranian trans and queer refugees and asylum seekers in Turkey. And their chapter in the book is called What Counts as Violence? Transgender Refugees, Torture, and Sanctions. And then we have Rema Hammami, leading scholar of women, gender, and development in Palestine, an associate professor of anthropology at Birzeit University. She's director of its PhD program in interdisciplinary social sciences, and she was a founding member of its Institute for Women's Studies. And we've been lucky to have her here at Columbia before as a Carnegie Fellow, and I've been lucky to have her as co-editor, co-conspirator, co-convener of the whole project and the book. And I think her imprint is on every smart sentence that's in the book. And her chapter is called Catastrophic Aid, GBV Humanitarianism in Gaza. Nina Berman is an award-winning photojournalist here at the Columbia School of Journalism and was one of several journalists we were excited to have join us in this interdisciplinary project, recognizing that actually for the production of a common sense for the public, journalists are truly key, and critical journalists like Nina are gifts to this world. And her contribution to the book is titled, which I think you may be talking about something slightly different today, but the contribution to the book is called Dressed Up, Stripped Down, Media Depictions of Conflict Rape. And finally, at the end, we have Shenila Khoja-Moolji, who's now Associate Professor of Muslim Studies at Georgetown University, author of 3 remarkable books, and one of us here in that she got her doctorate at Columbia. And we asked her to moderate today, even though she'll actually be speaking about her own chapter and work in Pakistan in the webinar that we're having on October 11th that's sponsored by the Barnard Center for Research on Women. And it's going to be a webinar so that people around the world can actually attend. And this will be actually the third launch for the book. I don't know how we got so ambitious. The third launch for the book, which will be around the theme of securitization and the violence of law. And we have a terrific lineup, big lineup for that one, and I'll be speaking on that theme as well. And if any of you have friends in California, tomorrow you could go to another launch at the University of California, Berkeley, with some fabulous people, but probably you're not going to be there by tomorrow. So, and what we're going to do, we're going to record all of them because we didn't want to do the live streaming and the webinar and just all of that, but we're trying to video them all so that we can then post them later for everybody to share in different time zones, because 6 p.m. is not a great time for many people around the world. I think without further ado, I want to turn it over to you. Each of them is going to talk for about 10 to 12 minutes, and poor Shenila has the job of timing them a bit, and then moderating the discussion afterwards. But I just wanted to thank you all for being here, and it's just wonderful to see the faces of people who've been involved in this project for a long time. So thank you.
All right, I guess I'm first. Thank you, Lila. There are many thanks to give in this room, but since time is short, I'll just say we're all very lucky to have you in our worlds, and Rema will expand on our thanks. So, this is a very long paper, shortened considerably. About 10 years ago, a cluster of news stories and policy reports on child marriage, invariably accompanied by colorful visuals of garishly made-up brides, began to circulate globally. In particular, accounts of child marriage in Bangladesh appeared ubiquitous. These ranged from human rights reports on climate change and a foreign policy journal special issue investigating the links between global sex trafficking and Bangladesh's child marriage problem, to alarmist reports by organizations with names such as Girls Not Brides, and to copious statistics produced by various multilateral development institutions. The emergence of this unanticipated category, as I call it, and I call it that because as somebody who follows Bangladeshi feminism very closely and is involved in it, this was not on the radar of the various feminist movements. So it was interesting, but that is what prompted me, this sort of being bombarded through journalism and through other fora, including intellectual fora, on the issue of child marriage in Bangladesh, prompted me to probe more deeply into the circuits of power, the assumptions, the differential stakes through which this new discursive regime had just sprung to life, it seemed. Like sati unveiling, child marriage in colonial South Asia and the MENA region signaled cultural backwardness, as you all probably know. By the early 20th century, the girl child and her sexual consent in marriage featured centrally in nationalist debates, and many, many people have written about this, on social reform in colonial Bengal. And that is important because part of colonial Bengal became East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, which is my analytical site. That earlier discussion, however, revolved primarily around the identity of upper caste Hindu communities. There's a tendency to just draw a straight line between that and what's happening in Bangladesh, and I really want to insist on specification. The stakes for Muslim Bengalis were relatively muted and indirect. Curiously, though, or perhaps not so curiously given what's happening in India right now, in the politically volatile decades of the 1920s and 1930s, Hindu nationalists actively sought to sever any association of child marriage with Brahmanical norms, seeking to recast it as a specifically Muslim problem originating from the Prophet's marriage to Aisha. These older civilizational logics endure in many forms in Bangladesh, but the new common sense around child marriage is mediated through distinct intersecting conditions of global capitalism, nationalism, and developmentalism. The cunning of this new discourse, I argue, lies in its power to naturalize a particular vision of economic development and the good life, placing limits on individual and community horizons of expectation, and in some cases, doing actual harm. So in my chapter, I suggest that the panic over child marriage does crucial ideological work, smoothing over contradictions around discourses of female empowerment and poverty reduction. Here we might ask, following Lila Abu-Lughod, what Bangladeshi girls are being saved to as they are saved from child marriage. Quite likely, their aspirations center on employment in one of the several million apparel export factories that dot the urban landscape. And I imagine most of you have heard about Bangladeshi garment factories for the disasters that they're there, but they're also very important within the other kinds of discourses on female empowerment. This is the point, I would contend, the point at which the cunning of a particular kind of governmentality is most powerfully at work. The mobilization of the category of child marriage, understood as a barbaric practice and violent cultural norm, standing in the way of girls' empowerment and of national, perhaps even global development, works to obscure the actual capitalist violence awaiting those who labor in factories. I want to make clear that I do not advocate for child marriage, however that's defined, nor am I implying that all Bangladeshi garment factories are sweatshops trapped in some backward time, in need of some Euro-American rescue plan, not at all. Rather, the affective power of this discourse is to shift the source and the site of scandal, what is really scandalous, from the neoliberal state and the hyper-extractive financialized global order in which this state is nested, to the realm of culture and norms, to Muslim patriarchy, or to patriarchy, therefore foreclosing critical lines of interrogation and of imagining alternative futures. It doesn't hurt, of course, if the culprits are racialized predatory men, preferably Muslim, and predominantly Bangladesh is that. So, far from being a timeless tradition or a historical category, child marriage resurfaces, as I show in my research, in Bangladesh around the same time, as a feminist and developmentalist concern, around the same time as the girl child increasingly eclipses the third world woman as agent of development, global development discourse, corresponding to the financialization of development, as Ananya Roy, among others, has written about, in which Bangladesh's Grameen Bank-inspired microfinance played a crucial role. So there's this constant intersecting of so-called local and transnational global. Indeed, the affective charge of the figure of the child within broader transnational humanitarian logics of that moment facilitated this transition to centering the girl child. Notably, in the decade between 2008 and 2018, the discursive ground shifted dramatically, with liberal feminism and smart economics conjoined through the resuscitated specter of child marriage. Among other things, the Sustainable Development Goals in Target 5.3 began to classify child, early, and forced marriage under the same rubric as female genital cutting, as under the same rubric as, what is it called, harmful cultural practice. It's really interesting to see there's no explanation why all of these things go together. But as genital cutting, as the late and much missed Sally Mary notes, is the poster child and prototype of the category of harmful cultural practices. So if you place child marriage alongside FGC, you can conjure up a very specific kind of cultural horror, right? And I could go on about that, but let me just turn to the implications of the success in highlighting the plight of the girl child, you could say, right? The centering of the girl child. First and crucially, and Michelle Murphy in particular has written about this, the girl becomes potentially valuable. The girl's worth at this point, and including the Bangladeshi girl's worth, becomes all about her rate of return. But this rate of return hinges on a strict compliance with a set of gendered expectations. The girl who can be the worthy subject of development must adhere to certain kinds of heterosexual propriety. She can't get pregnant, she can't drop out of school, she can't elope. If she does this, and if you actually read studies of programs that Nike and other on the girl effect that are put together, then she's cast out, she's evacuated, she's not there. Second, conceptualizing early marriage as a violation of the child's rights, that is of, according to UNICEF, anyone under 18, produces a homogenized and flat reading of otherwise complex social conditions and life courses, so of possible forms of redress. And how am I doing for time? Okay.
You're good.
Oh, okay.
10 minutes.
I have 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. These flattened readings draw on and reproduce a series of oppositions around, sexual innocence, but also they mark certain female bodies as transgressive and troublesome. So the girls who are actually trying to resist social and cultural norms kind of fall out of the development narrative too. But this particular figuration also displaces potentially thorny questions around adolescent female sexuality, consent, and agency, and as I show in the chapter, ultimately produces a very serious double bind for feminists.
Sorry, it was 2 minutes.
I knew it's now she says it's 2 minutes and not 10 minutes. Okay. There is a lot I could do, but obviously I'm going to do it in the, I knew. Yes, I will do, I'm happy to answer questions about this, but you get the gist of my talk. I do want to say of my chapter, I wanted to end up with something that last night as I was reading my chapter and as I was talking to a friend who had just arrived from Britain, I remembered I wanted to end with something she pointed out about this new law, apparently, that's going into coming into being, apparently, as we speak, in Britain. I have a section on how, the way in which there's a reinscription of colonial and imperial hierarchies that's racialized around which places have, in which prevailing discourses of child marriage sort of stick and which places don't. So you don't think about the U.S. as having a child marriage problem. Technically, you could if you were just looking at the laws, but there is no cultural outrage or horror. Nothing sticks, right, to that. So I have this section on a little bit of the racialization of these things. But what is interesting when I was talking last night is that I don't know how many of you know the case of Shamima Begum, who was a 15-year-old British citizen who joined the war in ISIS, or ran away to Syria and married an ISIS fighter. And it's really instructive to think about how her case is handled. From all accounts, she was groomed online under existing sort of the larger feminist dispensation. It seems her case could have been framed one of a child bride who had been sexually trafficked. I mean, really, it had. I read a lot of the accounts last night. Instead, what the British state did was strip her of her citizenship. And Shamima Begum is interesting, is her parents were born in Bangladesh, so they tried to actually return her to Bangladesh, but of course the Bangladeshi state refused it because she's never been to Bangladesh. All right? Anyway, so but the British state deemed her a danger to national security and basically has left her stateless. So racialization works in very many different ways, and especially under the current security regime, the kind of thing I think that Lila and others are going to talk about in their work. A very different racial logic of citizenship is at work, and not everybody, and I've criticized the whole child bride thing, but of course not everybody can even come under the umbrella of the child bride and trafficked. It's a very, this is where the specificity becomes so important. Thank you. That was very funny.
Do you want to go or do you want
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll go. No, good. You want to? No.
Okay. We're a bit confused about the order of things. As one of the co-editors of the book, I'd like to second my thanks to everyone that Lila just thanked. But I would also like to express my, and I know Neda's, gratitude to Lila for her immense and unflagging energy in this whole journey. It's been a wonderful experience working through these issues together. But throughout, Lila was so often the one doing the bureaucratic and logistic heavy lifting, as well as gently and constantly driving us all forward to completion, if not victory. And I think, as everyone here would attest to, Lila is a super supportive big sister, a relentless cheerleader, gentle and not always gentle taskmaster, and ultimately a very, very kind and giving goddess. Thank you, Lila. So, my engagement in sort of these issues of global gender violence against women agendas, is really a product of my location and experience at the Institute of Women's Studies at Birzeit University in the occupied West Bank. Very soon after we were founded in the mid-1990s, the Oslo peace process arrived, and we found ourselves as the only gender studies academic program on the front line receiving end of whatever was the latest global gender agenda being promoted by the flood of international institutions and aid agencies who had come for the peace-building, state-building moment. And at that time, there was a very vibrant Palestinian women's movement marked by a long legacy of homegrown activism. But very quickly, we saw how the power and resources of these international agencies was able to establish a whole new language around women and gender in our context. Things like, I'm sure many of you have heard of them, gender empowerment, mainstreaming, women in good governance, etc. Then, once that peace process imploded very violently in the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, we saw these same agencies suddenly shift to what we later recognized as the global violence against women agenda. And that agenda really very quickly took up a position of becoming the singular global gender agenda being applied in Palestine. Compared to previous ones, it swamped everything else out and has remained hegemonic for more than 15 years. Now, almost any women's agenda, if you want to get donor funding or whatever for it, has to justify itself in the language of what it's going to contribute to addressing violence against women. And at the Women's Studies Institute, we, very, very quickly found the kind of hegemonic representations of gender relations and violence in Palestinian society that were being produced by these global frames and discourses really, really troubling, in which Palestinian society is represented as one where male violence against women in the family is rampant, and it's always going up, by the way. It's socially pervasive and condoned, even by women themselves. And all of this just simply didn't represent what we knew from our own experience and research about our society. It just didn't add up. So all of us at the Institute have, over various times, either tried to critically engage the agenda or critique it, but without getting very much traction. It is just so powerful. And my own personal first line of attack was to try and deconstruct the evidence base, which had sort of instantiated this whole apparatus in Palestine based on this common sense that domestic violence is a huge problem in Palestine, and as I said, is always on the rise. Statistics, as also in the case of Bangladesh and child marriage, is, really fundamental for getting this agenda to take off in any context. And that's a long story. You can read my chapter in Janet Halley's edited book, Governance, Feminism, Notes from the Field. But basically what I found was that there was a kind of statistical apartheid going on in which global normative frames of international agencies had a specific frame used only in the Third World to measure prevalence levels of domestic violence, and it was inbuilt into the frame that it would produce high numbers so that it could confirm the kind of epidemic levels of domestic violence in Third World contexts. And that frame is never used in the Global North. Global North, feminists actually have their own problem of trying to prove domestic violence is a problem because the frames that are used actually make it almost impossible to come out with high prevalence levels. So my chapter in the book focuses on how that global anti-violence agenda practically plays out on the ground in Gaza, and the way that local women's organizations and frontline workers in Gaza have to try and negotiate the huge gap between these global normative interventions to address violence against women and the actual needs and context of Gazan women, including survivors of domestic violence. So I think many of you might have some idea of the broader context of the Gaza Strip. Nobody can find the right language to express the multi-layered levels of Israeli state and geopolitical violence it's under, animal pen, largest open-air prison, refugee population who for the past 17 years have been under crushing Israeli siege, plus devastating international sanctions, and then coming on top of that, have undergone 3 massive Israeli wars on Gaza, one-sided wars, with the population having nowhere to find safety nor flee. I mean, it's 17 years now. And, you know, in that process, what you have is the mass immiseration of the vast majority of the population, with the only economy able to operate, besides the illicit one, which is tunnel economy, is the humanitarian economy, the resources and aid offered by the humanitarian industry. So that global anti-violence agenda enters Gaza under the umbrella of humanitarianism and within a humanitarian frame. And humanitarians use the language of GBV, gender-based violence, as opposed to the developmental institutions use violence against women. That's another long story. And it enters as part of the humanitarian frame and, of course, as part of this humanitarian economy, the only game in town. Due to the international sanctions regime, the humanitarians boycott any work with the standing Hamas government, and instead, the global agenda conscripts Gaza's highly precaritized community of women's organizations to deliver these anti-violence interventions. When all resource flows are channeled through these narrow humanitarian frames, it creates an incredible dependency marked by relations of material coercion. There are no alternatives for Gaza's NGO women activists and frontline anti-violence workers, as well as the destitute women seeking their services. They have little choice but to work within these humanitarian modalities, but constantly subvert their everyday logics in attempting to meet actual needs and priorities. So in the chapter, I go into detail how the various types of interventions mandated by the humanitarian industry operate in Gaza. And the list of interventions is, it's a highly codified set menu, versions of which you can find anywhere the humanitarian industry now operates in the world. And the vast majority of humanitarian resources to combat Gaza's gender violence problem is put into what I call civilizational pedagogies, awareness training sessions for the mass of women across Gaza, and annual mass campaign around violence against women. The awareness training sessions are delivered by local women and human rights NGOs that reach the mass of Gazan women by delivering them at their local neighborhood community charity, or CBOs. And in these sessions, what they're doing is they're teaching them sort of standard formulas about women's rights as human rights, international frameworks around women, and international frameworks around violence against women, all very abstract stuff. And then you have the public awareness campaigns under the global template of, maybe you've heard of it, the UN's 16 Days of World Action Against Violence. Yeah, you see some heads nodding. And annually, this is staged with massive funds every year in Gaza and also in the West Bank by the international community. And it's composed of a series of public activities, theater, radio spots, art, poetry competitions, all splattered with, the logos of the international agencies as well as the global brand of the UN 16 Days. Then I focus on the gap between humanitarian claims and representations around these interventions and what they're actually doing on the ground. And just one example, the awareness-raising workshops, which are highly touted by humanitarian organizations. They've reached thousands of women and sometimes men across the Gaza Strip who they've brought into these sessions, changing hearts and minds around, women's rights and getting them to stand up to gender violence, etc. Instead, as all of the NGOs involved in delivering them know, these sessions function as part of the internal humanitarian trickle-down economy. Destitute women arrive often with their children. They come to get the free lunch that always goes with these sessions. Oftentimes, the NGO workers have this dilemma of not enough sandwiches also for the children. And more importantly, the women arrive in order to network and get access to channels of humanitarian aid that might flow through their local community organization, which have functioned as main conduits of aid. This isn't a new story. The SGBV literature on the Congo, anthropologists showed exactly the same thing in what they called the political economy of SGBV programming, sexual violence, sexual gender-based violence, and how it creates what they call perverse incentive structures. Now, those two modalities are where the vast majority of humanitarian GBV resources go. Practical interventions like psychological services, legal aid, even medical interventions for women who are actual victims get almost nothing compared to these highly performative interventions. And very critically, the needs voiced by actual victims of domestic violence are completely off the list, such as independent housing for women with their kids who want to leave an abusive marriage, or employment and financial support so that they can do so. Instead, actual solutions for actual victims of violence are undertaken by women NGO activists in a parallel world of homegrown interventions, completely outside of these humanitarian modalities. And there are a number of these, but among them is working with the internationally boycotted Only Women's Shelter in Gaza that is run by Hamas women's activists, young professionally trained social workers and psychologists, who the two types of activists, Hamas, non-Hamas, they have a lot in common when it comes to actually meeting context-specific needs of women in Gaza. And the Hamas women activists critically know how to negotiate context-specific solutions for individual women across sympathetic networks they have built in the Hamas government and within the religious hierarchy, which is not always Hamas. So just to close, I want to give two examples of the Cunning, seeing we were all asked to mention the Cunning. So the codified interventions, such as the awareness sessions, what they do is they create the appearance of the problem and the appearance of the need for the intervention. Women showing up proves there is a problem of GBV, and that they keep showing up proves the need for even more of these interventions. When in fact, women are showing up because of the devastating effects of the larger violence of Israeli siege and sanctions and military destruction on their lives. And in the process of delivering all of these interventions, the whole apparatus of humanitarianism is instantiated along with the international community as saviors of Gaza women from their violent men, right, patriarchal Islamic culture, rather than being what they are, complicit with the larger forces and logics of state, colonial, and geopolitical violence that has devastated women's lives as well as the lives of Gazans more generally. Thank you.
All right. So I also want to thank, Nina for helping organize this, and Lila for all the work, and also for inviting me. I came very late into this project, thanks to Lila, so thank you, and also Rema for all the editorial suggestions and wonderful work, and Nadara, of course, who's not here. It's truly an honor to be a part of this project, even though I joined late, and also to be on this panel. I apologize for taking my mask off. I arrived today, and I was on a very full plane, so hopefully I won't give you all COVID. But it was just too hot. I couldn't breathe and talk at the same time. So before I give a summary, first of all, I want to make sure that I got the assignment. I think Nina encouraged us to talk rather than read, and I'm going to try to point to the cunning of gender-based violence in cases of queer and trans refugee applicants in Turkey. So before I give a summary of my chapter in this book, I want to say a few words about why I'm critical of refugee regimes, refugee rights regimes, and human rights regimes, and how I came to this project. Because I think it is quite important to contextualize this work, especially when objections to any critique of human rights or refugee rights is accused of cooptation. We are often accused of being apologists for the states that are marked as violators of human rights, or at best, we are told that we minimize the local cis heteropatriarchies or the violence of transphobia or homophobia in the so-called global south. So I want to talk about why it's important, or why I came to do this project as someone who actually worked in a major human rights organization, International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. At the time, now it's called Outright. But I worked there, and I was telling Rema earlier about the horrifying, almost comical experiences that I had working there, exaggerations, gross exaggerations that become documents about country files that are fabrications based on fantasies of some of the people in this organization. So that's part of the experience I had in the 90s. And I also got asylum based on sexual orientation in early 90s. So until I came to the US in 89. And at that time, sexual deviance was, meaning homosexuality, was grounds for exclusion. So I had to actually lie and say, have you been involved in any sexual deviance? No. Have you been involved in communist activity? No. Both of them were yes. But then, sure enough, in early 90s, I got asylum based on sexual orientation, the second lesbian case in the US. And not to throw shade on any journalists here, but soon after I got my asylum, a journalist called and wanted to interview me, and it was pretty graphic, almost pornographic, asking questions about sex life in Iran and all that. And when I refused to conduct the interview, he was a white gay man, and he said, we gave you asylum, honey. The least you could do is to talk about it. So that expectation from the refugee to basically be indebted and constantly talk about basically the suffering in the so-called home country was quite eye-opening for me, and also the experiences I had at Eaglehurk at that time. And the reason I actually started this particular project on queer and trans refugee applicants in Turkey is because while I was a grad student doing field work on Weblogistan, a trans Iranian woman who, after a couple of years of waiting in Turkey, had made it to Toronto, committed suicide. And her life was the subject of many, many films about the horrible condition of trans life in Iran. But when she died in Canada, no one talked about her death. And her death was basically not mentioned anywhere. And it became really interesting to me to think about politics of life and death, right? And geopolitics, relationship between geopolitics, which lives are worth protecting, which deaths become basically representable, and which ones cannot be mentioned. Her name in my work, I gave her a pseudonym, was SAYE. So we kind of, as an activist scholar in Turkey, along with a few refugees, we started an organization and named it SAYE. SAYE was one of the names that she was going by the way. So that is how I come to this work, and I think many of us who write about these issues are not just doing it for the sake of critique. We are doing this work because we genuinely actually care about the people that human rights organizations, refugee rights organizations claim to protect, but they fail to do so miserably. So I think it's important to take that into consideration rather than complete rejection of these kinds of critiques as elitist or far from reality, because I think Shenila, I think you're going to ask this question and I'm jumping the gun, but for whom are we writing these? I think for some of us it's important that the policies change, that the practices of refugee rights or the concept of rights needs to be questioned altogether. There are people who have written about this. Maya has a fantastic article also about human rights. So before talking about actually the specifics, and I agree with Dina that specifics are important, I kind of want to summarize why, or if you ask me what my general critiques of refugee rights regimes are, and when I say refugee rights regimes, by the way, I mean states, particular states that fund organizations such as UNHCR, and the US is the largest funder of UNHCR because they want to set refugee policies. They want to keep refugees out of the US, so they give a lot of money to basically set refugee policies. Particular states, NGOs, so-called non-governmental organizations, refugees themselves who have to perform particular forms of being in the world so that they could be recognized by UNHCR as refugees. And of course, diasporic opposition groups in the case of Iranian diaspora that have particular political agendas, even if they're deeply homophobic or transphobic, all of a sudden they become trans rights activists or human rights activists, gay rights activists, and produce a particular kind of discourse. And I write about that in my chapter, but the discourse of gender affirming surgeries in Iran being marked as a form of torture and therefore grounds for asylum for trans people who go to Turkey, and I will talk about that in a second. But in general, my critiques are of this refugee rights regime is that these regimes basically produce the subjects that they come to represent, right? And this is basically a Foucauldian concept, right? Power produces what it comes to represent. So in the discursive level, how refugee regimes come to define what it means to be gay, how to perform gayness, what does it mean to be trans, right? What does it mean to be refugee? What does it mean to be human, right? So the kind of production, discursive production of the subjects. But when I say they come to produce the subjects, I also mean in the material sense of it, not just discursive level, because the conditions that produce refugees are ones that are erased in these refugee discourses and refugee rights discourses. In the case of Iran, I argue that it is actually sanctions, the US sanctions, that has forced many people, millions of Afghan refugees who for a couple of decades had lived in Iran, to leave Iran to seek asylum in a third country of asylum. And it is exactly, and this is something that actually a UNHCR officer told me, that between 2009 and 2013, the number of non-European refugees who filed asylum or applied for asylum in Turkey rose from 5,000 to 50,000. And that is not because of Syrian refugees. Often people assume it's because of the Syrian refugee crisis, but they're administratively different category altogether. It's because of the number of Afghan refugees who left Iran after Obama's sanctions. And I know that Clinton teaches here now, but you know, she basically, and she's the one who said gay rights are human rights. But a lot of people who left Iran, including queers, including trans people, left exactly because of the violence, economic violence of sanctions, where working class people, people who are the most vulnerable segments of the Iranian society, had to work 4 or 5 jobs to make the ends meet. And the ones who were and are at the margins of the society, including Afghan refugees, basically were denied jobs because, of course, when there is economic devastation, refugees and immigrants are scapegoated anywhere in the world, including in Iran, and queer and trans people, working class queer and trans people. So the number of Afghan refugees increased, and therefore UNHCR could not handle. They actually in 2013 stopped altogether processing Afghan refugee cases in Turkey. And since then, things have changed drastically. UNHCR has basically thrown out the towel, is that the expression? Yeah. And basically said we can't do it. They have delegated the administrative responsibilities to the Turkish state's Ministry of Interior, which is devastating for queer and trans refugees under Erdogan's government. So, and that has meant that, you know, the process that would take 1 or 2 years before 2010 now is taking 10 years. In the book, in the chapter, I talk about a case of a trans guy who immediately got an interview. And that is because when I went to talk to the commissioner, UNHCR commissioner, at that point they thought, you know, I'm a professor and I'm going to say good things about UNHCR. After writing an article, you know, UNHCR never talked to me after that. So, but which is, you know, another thing, you know, how do we write about these things so that we don't sever our relationship with these organizations? But UNHCR is ineffective anyway, so I guess that doesn't matter anymore. But so when I went to talk to this UNHCR officer, how much time do I have?
2 minutes.
Okay, I'll make it fast.
Asking.
But so he basically said, give me the name of the trans guys or trans women with whom we have spoken. And I was pleased because, of course, you know, queer and trans refugees, in particular trans refugees who cannot pass, are subjected to all kinds of violence in small towns in Turkey. But he said the reason was that we know that there are survivors of torture. And that is a discourse that is actually produced by Iranian opposition groups in diaspora. I write about Justice for Iran organization that produced this long document about how gender, they call it sex reassignment surgeries, gender affirming surgeries, are forms of torture. And that is why UNHCR was prioritizing trans cases as survivors of torture, which is interesting. You know, to think about how these discourses are produced and circulated, and how refugees themselves repeat this, that I am a survivor of torture. But the interesting part about all of this is that none of this actually helped trans refugees. The same trans guy that I talk about, he was interviewed immediately, but he ended up waiting for 10 years before he made it to Canada through private sponsorship, not even through UNHCR. And that is because they had, with his partner, they had, at that time, an 8-year-old son. But by the time, after 9.5 years, he was almost 18, so he couldn't apply with them. And as a cis straight man, he was an Iranian. He was suspect, you know, as being a terrorist, you know. So it was interesting to see how his father's trans guy was basically basis for asylum, but their son was the reason for them to be delayed at one point. But the other reason was that when they're, you know, during the time they were waiting, Canada basically closed its borders to non-Syrian refugees while Trudeau was taking photo op, you know, pictures and all that. So a lot of queer and trans refugees asked me, well, should we change our country of asylum? And I said, I have no idea. And many people actually changed it from Canada to the US, and I'm going to finish with this. But then Trump happened, and the Muslim ban happened, so people could not come to the US either. And what UNHCR did was to mark their cases as refuses to resettle, which means that the cases were never opened again, and people basically lived in this limbo. And many people actually, this is something that has the cunning of violence, is that this form of violence, this form of waiting without knowing what's going to happen to you, how many more interviews you're going to have to do, causes deep depression among many refugees, the number of suicides that happen, and the number of people who die from lack of health care under the protection of refugee rights. People cannot work, they have to pay for their own expenses, they don't have access to health care. So this is the kind of thing. Why is that? UNHCR, knowing that the sanctions are the reason for so many people to leave Iran, focus on torture, gender affirming surgeries as torture, but does not ever talk about sanctions, economic sanctions, as the reason that people become refugees. So I'm going to stop there, but I'll be more than happy to talk about the specifics of the cases in the Q&A. Thank you.
I'm going to come up here because I'm going to show some pictures. First, thank you, Lila. I'm still kind of in awe that I'm sitting at this table with this group. So thank you for including me in this book. I'm really excited we're holding this event here in the journalism school because many of the patterns described by these scholars are affirmed and amplified by journalists, especially photojournalists. Industry economics is partially to blame. In the 1990s, budgets for long-term visual reporting started to decline and then really took a nosedive with the digital revolution and the bust in the media advertising model. And so photojournalists started looking for alternative funding sources to do their work. At the same time, the humanitarian industry grew more sophisticated in its communication strategies and saw photojournalists as useful allies in the delivery of their message. So MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, kind of led the way, but the rest followed: Save the Children, UNICEF, UNHCR, Human Rights Watch, and UNFPA, now UNFP, which supported much of Stephanie Sinclair's photography work on child brides in Yemen, India, Nepal, and elsewhere. Her pictures were truly a medium phenomenon, published everywhere in the US and Europe, including Nat Geo, NBC, NPR, New York Times, and the list goes on. She continues that work today through her multi-million-dollar organization, Too Young to Wed. So for photographers, NGOs, and publications, this symbiotic arrangement is a win-win. The NGOs cover the basic reporting costs, provide access to locations, help identify characters, get permissions, and the photographers create work which can be used as promotional material for the NGO and as journalism. This means that the humanitarianism construct, which often revolves around a rescuer and victim narratives, is firmly embedded in photojournalism culture, which is still driven largely by white American and European photographers documenting the other in Africa and Asia, far from their own home bases. As a result, certain issues are made hypervisible, as we have seen, and others are ignored or given different treatment. And so, but there's also something particular about the photographs themselves which are being made. For work to cut through the attention economy, to be seen as innovative and impactful, worthy of recognition, journalists and their editors are veering into ethically dubious territory. They're also creating images that in their aesthetic quality and framing are at odds with the very feminist concerns they claim motivated the reporting in the first place. So my chapter in the Cunning of Gender Violence focuses on images of conflict rape. My interest in the subject started when I was a young journalist in 1987, and I went to Vietnam with a group of American veterans from that war. While in Ho Chi Minh City, we were mobbed by dozens of children born from American soldiers. The children were looking for their fathers, and they followed us to the airport, thinking we might bring them back to the US. They were sobbing when we left. It was truly a heartbreaking scene. The US press rarely reports on rape by American soldiers, except, and this is large part due to Helen Benedict, who's in our audience today, who wrote The Lonely Soldier, about American soldiers raping other American soldiers. But these Vietnamese children, who are now adults, are described as having been born from relationships or love encounters between American troops and Vietnamese women. This is quite a euphemism. We know very well from the brilliant work by Gina Marie Weaver and more recently the indispensable Nick Turse that rape was widespread, horrific, and standard operating procedure during the American war against Vietnam. A few years after I went to Vietnam, I went and covered in 1992 and 1993 the war in Bosnia for Time and Newsweek. I photographed and interviewed wartime rape survivors and their loved ones who had been forced to flee their homes in a war of ethnic cleansing. Some women wanted to be identified and others wanted to remain anonymous, and I photographed them both ways. 20 years later, one of those pictures circulated on the internet, and a woman I had not talked to in all that time emailed me to say she was terrified because her husband had no knowledge of her past trauma, and I needed to remove the picture, which I did as fast as I could, as best as one can in the internet age. This was, of course, a horrifying moment for her and a mortifying one for me. I've since asked myself, how can we as photojournalists and feminists do better and be more responsible to the people in our pictures? And so it was with great interest when I saw this photograph published in Time in 2016. It was made by the celebrated American photographer Lindsay Addario to go along with a story by Aaron Baker about rape survivor programs primarily in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The title of this story is The Secret War Crime, and you see this language frequently. The secret war crime, the secret life of child brides. It's a promise that the reader is going to be led into some dark, forbidden territory. So if you look at the image and really deconstruct what's going on here, we see a background that's gray and bland without any spatial or temporal context. The woman could be waiting to be examined in a medical office here at Columbia, or anywhere for that matter, right? For some viewers, myself included, the picture in its composition and gaze recalled the specimen studies researchers made of enslaved people in the American South. The woman in the picture is named Ayak, but we don't hear from her till the very end of the story. She operates instead as an aesthetic lure, a generic illustration, a stand-in for every Black African wartime rape survivor. Eventually, we're told that Ayak lost her family to a rebel attack in South Sudan. While on the run, she was raped, then raped again at a UN camp, impregnated and infected with AIDS. Her quote is, "I want a family, I want a husband, but the doctors say there is no cure for my disease. No one will ever marry me," unquote. The writer, Baker, then tells us that Ayak cradles her pregnant belly with both hands, smiles sadly as she envisions a lonely future, quote, "This baby will be my friend, he will keep me company," unquote. And that is all we hear from Ayak. So how did this shocking photograph, which was also the cover of Time's international print edition, come about? We learn that the idea for the picture came to the photographer in her sleep. When she woke up, she checked in with Kimberly Smith, an Alabama woman who runs Make Way Partners, the Christian NGO where Ayak was being sheltered. Smith is also a rape survivor and has carefully cultivated her own rape into a media commodity, writing a book and granting interviews. Here's one headline about Smith from Glenn Beck's The Blaze. How a courageous Christian woman who survived rape at the hands of slave raiders in Sudan keeps braving bombs and violence to save orphans. So Smith liked the idea of photographing Ayak, nearly naked, and Addario says Ayak didn't hesitate. The experience is then reported as a moment of sisterhood among survivors, whereby the journalists helped create for the subject an empowering transformation. The reporting and picture taking become a vehicle for Ayak's emotional healing. Addario tells us what happened. Quote, "Over time, Ayak's body language changed. She stood proudly, more confidently at peace. It seemed the very act of photographing Ayak and her unborn child gave her the opportunity to celebrate the very thing her perpetrators had tried to rob from her, her beauty and her dignity." This is Addario continuing. "For 2 days, we all shared deeply personal experiences which often culminated in tears and sometimes oddly in laughter. Photographing Ayak and listening to her story was a privilege, an extremely positive, intimate moment amongst three women who had in all, in fact, experienced some form of rape or sexual assault as a weapon of war in our lives. Okay, so Ayak was violently displaced from her home country and lost her family. She was raped multiple times at age 17. She became pregnant with no access to abortion. She has HIV and is apparently without medicine. She is living in a state of poverty in a safe house in a foreign country run by an American woman she only recently met. She's about to have her first baby with no clear means of support or family structure and no path back to her country. There's absolutely no equivalency here of experience with the feminist journalists. So Time and other publications brand themselves through their photographers and like to emphasize a photographer's state of mind, compassion, dedication, and sacrifice to the story, informing readers that the photographer and writer also experienced some form of sexual assault serves one purpose. It's designed to validate the image, production, and by extension, Time, the corporate entity, and put the reader at ease and calm any feelings of discomfort around the shocking picture. In this construction, Time is doing Ayak a favor. The very act of photographing her gave her a unique, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for her as a pregnant rape survivor to disrobe and proudly pose for all the world to see. Allowing a client, a refugee who has been raped and traumatized, to appear nearly naked in the international press is quite an ask. Does Ayak, or for that matter, any other rape survivor in a similar situation where their food, shelter, and well-being is dependent on one person or organization, feel free in that moment to say no? American editors have on many occasions refused to commission or publish pictures deemed too disturbing or sensitive for American audiences, or they find workarounds. This was the cover for a story on campus rape in the United States. Could anyone imagine an American journalist asking a white American teenager, 9 months pregnant, raped multiple times without a home or source of income or future security, to strip for a photo? Would we ever see this picture out of Ukraine, for instance? The timepiece on conflict rape is similar to a New York Times 2018 story. Hold on, I have to get that up here. About Boko Haram kidnap survivors. Like the Times story, the image of victimhood is reframed as female empowerment, and the reporters and photographers are cast as conduits for this transformation. Being seen, coming out, unveiling, entering the spotlight of the world stage in a kind of journalistic striptease becomes central elements of both stories. In the timepiece, the rape survivor disrobes to show her newly found confidence. In the New York Times piece, the survivors are prettied up to show their newly won dignity. In both, the body is highlighted and the politics and context are diminished. In both, the voices of the women themselves become secondary to the aestheticized representation of the female figure. All of this is justified as feminist storytelling. So in April 2004, more than 2,000 girls were kidnapped from a school in Nigeria, right? And the Times publishes this Boko Haram propaganda video. The story, like so many tales of female abduction, struck an attractive chord with Western editors who published multiple features about Boko Haram. The New York Times had been especially invested in covering the story primarily through the team of West Africa Bureau Chief Dion Searcy, paired with Australian war photographer Adam Ferguson. The piece opens with this text appearing on the black background. You scroll down, and a woman emerges. She's wearing bright red. Visually, this is liberation through wardrobe change. The girls have thrown off their Muslim robes, put on jewelry, makeup, fixed their hair, and are gorgeous. You scroll down woman after woman, 83 photographed in one day against different colored backdrops. They float in boxes across the screen. The viewer naturally goes to click on a picture, as I did, hoping for added text or maybe some audio, but there's nothing. The women are mute, only to be gazed upon, like princesses or catalog models. As the feature progresses, something strange happens. A select few subjects, we'll get to them, briefly come to life, right? Eyes move in a slow motion, a head ever so lightly tilts towards the camera. The project is called Portraits in Dignity, but actually the women are turned into objects, disconnected from their stories with a disturbing come hither animation. If not for the headline and the occasional caption, the presentation could pass as an online shopping page, hence reducing the women to objects of consumption, a decidedly unfeminist goal. There are also reporter's notes to the story, which you can read if you choose. And I'll just wrap up. In presenting these case studies, I'm not suggesting that journalists stop reporting on conflict, rape, or gender violence, nor am I trying to admonish or embarrass individual journalists. But when two of the most highest profile publications present work which claims solidarity with women, and yet their picture making is so problematic and prioritizes the female body over all else, it's important to ask what is going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these thoughtful presentations, and all of you actually did really well on time, so this is great.
Well, thanks to you.
Made my job really easy. So we have about 15 minutes for a Q&A session before we head to a reception with food. So may I request folks who have questions to please line up in the center with your questions, and to please keep the questions brief so that we can hear more from our panelists. And to start off with, while I give folks time to get up, maybe you can share a little bit more, as Sima started to do, about the kind of impact or the effect that you wish for your work to have in the world. Who do you wish for it to be taken up by?
Do you want to start first?
No, I said enough.
Sima preempted it already.
Darn. Okay. Gosh. Sometimes I think I write out of rage. A lot of, and probably we all do that in a sense, because there are these popular narratives that are circulating that are supposedly reflect us or the worlds with which we are intimately familiar. So part of what I hope to do is to try and, obviously I'm not going to shift any narratives but to try and make a dent, to chip away at those dominant narratives. So that's one thing. I personally actually write for my invisible feminist colleagues in Bangladesh who probably mostly don't particularly appreciate what I have to say and definitely disagree with me. But I am actually in conversation with them rather than necessarily with academia. And one of the things I notice is none of us is really trying to just go with the theory of the moment, in the same way that you have a topic of the moment, whether it's trafficking or child marriage. There are also theories of the moment, but I think all of us are really invested in particular sites and topics. And that comes with a certain kind of maybe responsibility, but also a certain kind of commitment. I think what I thought was really interesting was something that, Sima, you raised about not just for whom are we writing, which is important, but how then do we continue to write if we are, I find this all the time. How can you write about people you are in conversation with, but you are taking sort of the very heart of what they do and saying, you're actually, you're foundationally doing something foundationally wrong, or whatever, wrong isn't the right word, but, I think that's a very difficult space from which to come out, or that's a tricky terrain that in different ways, I see all of us inhabiting. So, some more than others, but I keep, I was so happy that today wasn't live streamed. But, but only, it's being very selfish. But, But anyway, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay. So I have no delusions that anything we wrote is really going to change anything quickly, you know, in international agencies and humanitarians, among humanitarians. And, you know, my chapter is actually based on a study I did with a Gaza colleague on their GB interventions in Gaza for UN Women in 2017 that had all of this critical stuff, and they published it, and we launched, and nothing happened, you know? They don't really even read their own reports. You know, I mean, it's so being able to disrupt them, I think is, you know, again, no delusions. I think what I hope is that, for instance, you know, I use my chapter, and will be using other chapters to teach back in Palestine, to teach my students. And I know at Columbia, I think you have a bunch of programs to prepare students to become international bureaucrats and humanitarians. You know, so give this to them in their classes, right? Not so that we can make any money, because we won't. But I think really sort of try and disturb and mix things up earlier on through teaching. And I think generally what I hope is, I was telling Lila, I have a colleague who's a BBC journalist who I just saw last week, and she was reporting, she was doing this report in Kenya, and they were doing this comparative thing on the impact of the cost of living problems worldwide on kids. And she was given a story that she was basically told by whoever her desk guys were, that you have to go to Mombasa and you're going to cover the story from the point of view of child trafficking, that families in Mombasa are trafficking their daughters and sons in order to deal with like economic crisis. And she sort of, you know, she went, she's not highly feminist, she's a good person. She sort of went and she was so troubled, and it was so wonderful to be able to say to her, you're so right to be troubled, you know? And, you know, take a look at this and read that and everything else. And I think I lot of people who are engaged in this stuff actually are somewhat uncomfortable, and I think it's very, very important that they have something laid out that sort of says, yes, be troubled, you know, be troubled. And I think that also goes, I think one of our hopes was engaging, you know, these global feminist, transnational, you know, the big rah-rahs of feminism in the international system, or the governance feminists. And I think it's very important to just keep troubling them. Yeah.
Should I say? Sure, yeah. So I agree with Rema that for teaching purposes, in particular for very enthusiastic, mostly white undergrads who want to go and save the world. Yeah, good people. So I was actually teaching a freshman seminar, and I named it Debbie Do-Gooder and the White Savior Cat, using Scott Long's memes of White Savior Cat, and, you know, we talked quite a bit about this. So I think teaching and pedagogical kind of purposes is one thing, but honestly for me, and in 2013, when I came back from doing field work, it was so devastating to see the situation of living in Turkey for queer and trans people, that on one hand you want to critique the refugee regimes, on the other hand, you know, you end up falling into the same pattern of writing about the suffering in Turkey this time, right? So it's kind of, you know, I call it in an article hermeneutics of miseration, that you have to constantly write about this suffering in order to get sympathy of people, in order to get someone's attention, right? And as Rema said, I don't have any illusions that anything would change with the refugee regimes, because I think actually it's not accidental. There are particular geopolitical agendas for all of this. So I don't think anything is going to change in that sense, in sense of policy. But perhaps the hope is that the activists, who are good people, will kind of have a more critical approach to thinking about human rights, to thinking about humanitarianism, refugee rights, and so on and so forth. So for me, it's, maybe it's useless, but kind of hoping for change over time, perhaps not in our lifetimes. Yeah.
It's really hard to present publicly a critique of work by people I know, commissioned by editors who I'm friends with. Honestly, if it wasn't for the safety of me working at this institution, I don't know if I would open my mouth, because I would be penalized, definitely. The work by these photographers, they're some of the most influential photographers in the profession, but there seems to be a critical gap when it comes to self-reflection of their own practice. There's also this business model, which is impossible, and I have no solutions for that. I do think that the post-George Floyd moment has been helpful in some situations in terms of questioning racialized approaches in image making and stereotypes, harmful stereotypes. I don't know if that Lindsay Addario picture could fly today, right? And it's interesting because the reporter's notes, which was published, have been removed from the Times site. So if you actually want to read her reflections, you have to go to the Internet Archive and find it. And so I'm only speculating why they were removed, but I'm hoping it's a positive thing that maybe, oh, okay. But then again, the picture has not been removed, right? And so, but I do think issues around consent, that we're talking about them, but, there's the overwhelming majority of journalists in the United States believe firmly in the American Empire Project. And they are not taught anything ever different, really, in education here. So it's a minority of journalists who are poking holes around this. And yeah, it's depressing, but here we are.
We'll open it up for questions from the audience. So there is a mic at the center, which is where folks are supposed to queue, but maybe you can raise hands and we can see. Please,
Please
yes,
stand
go
up.
ahead.
Everybody wants the reception, I think.
Yeah. We have a question here. Yeah, go ahead. Maybe you can enunciate and might be okay. I don't know.
Hi, my name's Tanya. I'm a master's student at the Human Rights Program. Professor Rema, you mentioned sort of this, not necessarily dilemma, but the story of, in the 90s, how we started, not started, but, how feminism was approached up an international sense then, and how it's evolved now, where it's sort of not necessarily a circus, but it is a public gesture that necessarily doesn't go anywhere when it comes to actually impacting survivors, whether it be in Gaza, whether it be in Sri Lanka post-war. But my question is, you mentioned practical interventions, whether psychological support or legal aid or help. Where do you see the sort of new space or the most impactful space being when making an actual change in working with survivors in post-conflict settings?
Oh, okay, very big question. It's not one size fits all. So I'm talking very specifically about Gaza. Gaza's not a post-conflict setting, by the way. And I think a lot of people in Sri Lanka would also arguably say to you that Sri Lanka isn't necessarily a post-conflict setting either. Yeah, exactly. And, I think the really important thing is some things travel and a lot of things don't. So some of the things that for instance, were found to be relevant in Gaza were grassroots, bottom-up interventions by battered women's movements that, had started in the 70s and 80s in the US and the UK. Victim-centered approach, all of that kind of ethic, that grassroots ethic translates into many, many different kinds of contexts. But the specific of the context, and I think that's one of the things that almost all of our chapters is pointing to, is that the specifics of the context become overwhelmingly important in these cases. And one of the huge problems of these global frameworks is one-size-fits-all type of thing, and it doesn't. And not only that, it can actually also be very, very destructive.
Any other questions?
I have not a question, but
Okay.
a comment following what Rema said. There are hundreds of thousands of young men and women from all over the world who come to universities, pay a lot of money to get MAs because they want to do good in the world and they want to work at the UN or these organizations like SIPA at Columbia, they pay a lot of money. And they get no critical thinking at all. At all.
They're going to
They
get
actually
Clinton now.
are taught by practitioners, not thinkers. Like, for example, SIPA now, Hillary Clinton is teaching.
Yep.
She has a class of 400 students there. I don't know what she's doing. I mean, this is a problem, so the critical analysis is not going to the people who actually want to do this work.
There's a question at the back. Do you want to ask? Yes, go ahead.
It's more of a comment, Nina. All of you, thank you. Wow. Having been in a photo editor in this business for 21 years now, and being on that side and seeing that and seeing your perspective, wow. I'd like to ask you, I've worked at Time. I've been there. I've seen it on the other side, and it's fascinating to see that perspective on it. Because at the time, as you say, and with George Floyd now, and diversifying the vision, the lens, it's happening. It's happening slowly, and it's being mandated too. It's like we need, and more of those people now are, I've got on panels at Eddie Adams and said, you know what, we don't need to parachute in anymore. Let the people tell their own story. Give them a camera, let them tell their own version of what they're experiencing. And I never thought of it from the humanitarian angle. Oh my God, thank you for enlightening me tonight. But it's like colonialism through the lens. And you should do a whole book on it. You should collect all these voices. And no, I commend you for speaking up tonight. Because I have many thoughts on this. And I've pitched things and thankfully got things published that I think have created new ground in this realm, but it's the white vision, and it's horrifying because it's not the world we live in. And just thank you. It's really eye-opening. Thank you. I would love to come to your class. It's my first time at Columbia.
Yeah, you should. Thanks for being here because, to answer your first question, I want editors and photographers to read this book, and you were mentioning that the students at SIPA are not given critical analysis. They're being taught by people who pretty much want to perpetuate the status quo. And honestly, this is the role of the private university today, okay? And it's just dissident voices that come in that try and trouble things up, right? And so the same is for journalists. We're not unique. The only thing is our influence is vast, and we can have ripple effects. So Stephanie Sinclair is documenting this so-called child marriage, but she's creating, in fact, the idea that there's a big problem. And the more pictures she makes, the bigger the problem gets, right, in the eyes of the public. So that if you think of what's really happening wrong with Yemen right now, it's that child marriage thing, right? I mean, can you imagine how perverse that is when you think of what's really happening in Yemen and that American feminists are worried about the child marriage? I mean, it's really like, if we didn't have to live it, it'd be so bizarre just to like step back and look, it's very strange. Or that someone would go all the way to Uganda, this little shelter run by this mad Christian woman, okay, to photograph a 9-month pregnant girl stripped naked. I mean, this is bizarre stuff. Yeah, but it, you know, it is presented as strong journalism, award-winning journalism, MacArthur Genius Fellow. I mean, something is really wrong, right?
Okay. Thank you. We are out of time, but we'll continue to make good trouble. Thank you so much for a wonderful